Hi, I'm Natalie Beerbreyer. I'm here to talk to you today about East St. Louis, one of the most notorious cities for crime and racial segregation. The average per capita income in East St. Louis is less than $13,000 per year.
Delmar Boulevard, a single street located in St. Louis, Missouri, doubles as a socioeconomic and racial dividing line. In 1916, during the Jim Crow era, St. Louis passed a residential segregation ordinance. This ordinance stated that if 75% of residents of a neighborhood were of a certain race, no one from a different race was allowed to move in. This ordinance did not stand as it was challenged in court by the NAACP. In response, racial covenants on housing were introduced. These prevented the sale of houses in certain neighborhoods to persons not of the Caucasian race. The racial covenants were ruled to be unconstitutional in 1948 when they were overturned in the Shelley versus Kramer Supreme Court case. 70% of the residents south of Delmar have at least a bachelor's degree, while only 10% of the residents north of Delmar have a bachelor's degree. Ferguson is one of 90 independent townships in the county. Its population was 74% white in 1990. Today, its 21,000 residents are more than two-thirds black. The asymmetry can be attributed to the political entrenchment of the remaining white community now in 2016 and low black voter turnout on election days. In segregated yet governmentally unified metro areas, Chicago's, for instance, property taxes on the rich help pay for schools and other services in poor neighborhoods. The city expands outward from there like an old-fashioned ladies' fan, bounded only by the Mississippi River. The east to west stretch of affluence has no collective name, but it divides the St. Louis metro area like the Great Wall of China. Middle-class whites live to the south, poor blacks to the north. A black 8-foot by 4-foot plywood box runs parallel to Delmar. There are mail slots installed at different heights on each side. Residents young and old are invited to deposit notes to opposite sides of the divide, to help start a real conversation and to begin to combat the ignorance and fear that plagues the city of St. Louis.
A third of adults reported not having a high school diploma, and over the past 5 years, enrollment at East St. Louis High School has taken a 25% nosedive.
In the past 6 decades, high school enrollment in East St. Louis went from over 100,000 students to under 30,000 students. This left over 20 schools abandoned in East St. Louis. And it all happened in the 80s and 90s when upper-class families moved to the suburbs, and people who could afford it stayed and put their kids into private schools, which left all the public schools underfunded.
So I grew up on the west side of St. Louis, and I went to a pretty well-funded high school, and kids from the city who, around their school districts, who had lower-funded education programs would get bused out to my high school. This is due to the socioeconomic and racial divide that has come from not only the Delmar Boulevard, but the Mississippi River and the Metro Link as well, which is the continuing problem for this segregation.
To me, image is any value in the exchange. Pleasure is accidental. In any event, it's hard to measure and harder still to memorize pleasure. Image stands in. To me, voice is that which gets stuck in the head of affected voice or in between the teeth, the hiss of love. Songs, eating. Whatever love says, it's no image, no consequence. This far inland, the erotic's only obvious is from a distance. This far inland, you need something more sexual than dichotomy. This is an excerpt from one of my favorite books. It's called Prairie Style by C.S. Giscombe. By introducing the idea of dichotomy, C.S. Giscombe is explaining how pleasure and love can be often confused and muddled. In this poem, 1200 North Road Going East, the poetic speaker seems to be at a location, and the title suggests appears to be thinking about the concept of fleeting pleasure. One important phrase that stood out to me is voice in which gets stuck into the head, affected voice, or in between the teeth, the hiss of love. This quote is contradictory to dichotomy. The hiss of love, referred to this phrase, contrasts the idea that love is rooted in fondness, while the hiss relates to the sign of derision. This far inland not only gives context to the geographical location, but also is a metaphor to the depth of the relationship between the two people. I think that the inland is representative of how people can get so far in a relationship when they are invested, but they cannot see for themselves what problems are. They are, in a way, blinded by their own love. Blindness. It's a word that hits us all very hard because, like the poem, they're blinded by love, but what we are blinded is, we're blinded by racial segregation in this community. And we don't see it because it doesn't affect us. And that's the real issue of St. Louis in today's world, that there's such a clear division and no one is trying to do something about it. And that's what we need to change right now.